Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. My name is Michael Camilleri. I direct the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program here. We're very pleased that so many of you could join us for today's discussion on the battle for Bolivia. In the days and weeks leading up to the October 20th election in Bolivia, and especially in the days and weeks since then, the situation in the country has been tense, uncertain, sometimes violent, and at various points, Bolivia's democracy and stability appear to be in jeopardy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there are strongly divergent views within Bolivia and outside the country about what happened, why it happened, and who is responsible. So today we're going to delve into some of those disagreements, but really our objective is not to reduce a complex and consequential issue to slogans and semantics. Our goal is to analyze the very delicate situation in Bolivia with the seriousness and sobriety that it deserves, and for everyone, hopefully, to walk away with a deeper understanding of what is happening in the country and some sense of a democratic, inclusive, and peaceful path forward. So in that spirit, I'm very pleased to welcome four panelists who are not only experts on Bolivia, but in some cases, protagonists in the current drama as well. To my immediate right, Ambassador Carlos Trujillo is the U.S. Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States. To his right, Ambassador Jaime Aparicio was Bolivia's ambassador to the United States from 2002 to 2006. As of yesterday, he is the Bolivian interim government's ambassador to the OAS and the UN. So clearly agreeing to speak at the dialogue is a fast track to an ambassadorship. Keep that in mind the next time we invite you to speak here, please. Felicidades, Jaime. To my left, Marcela Escobari is a senior fellow at Brookings. She was formerly the head of the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau at USAID, also formerly the executive director of the Center for International Development at Harvard. And to Marcela's left, John Walsh is director for the Andes and for drug policy at the Washington Office on Latin America. So really a stellar panel here. Grateful for them being here, grateful for all of you joining us. We're going to launch right into the conversation. I'll moderate and pose the questions for the first hour or so, and then we'll open it up to you all. So we're going to jump right in. I want to focus, again, mostly here today on what's happening now and what the path forward is. But I think it is important to look a little bit at how we got here, because the events that led to the resignation of President Evo Morales and the subsequent swearing in of an interim government led by former Senator Jeanine Áñez continue to divide opinion within and beyond Bolivia, and these divisions to some extent condition the path forward. So, Ambassador Aparicio, I'll start with you. Among your many titles is that of a Bolivian lawyer. So many of us have been studying the Bolivian Constitution in recent days. I wonder if you could tell us from your point of view what the Constitution says about the process for a presidential resignation, the process then for kind of a line of succession when that happens, and in your view, how those provisions were applied in this case.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, to having me here. I will start briefly in because if we talk about the Constitution and what happened these days, we have to know a little bit what of the background. Yesterday night, I was at a book presentation. It was a book called Reading Lolita in Tehran by a woman who talked about the previous book that was called The Republic of Imagination, where she was dreaming of a world of brotherhood, where people was there beyond their beliefs and beyond divides as gender or ethnic or social or political or religious differences. And I thought about what happened in Bolivia for 21 days, where all Bolivians from all kinds, and every Bolivian that is here know that that's a fact and it's true. That's why all Bolivians in all the cities, for millions, were 21 days protesting. It was a citizen pacific rebellion against the government. And the only tool they have was a paper asking for his resignation. And the reason of that, and now we go to your question, is that Evo Morales, who was a president, a very popular president, elected with a massive support, with 2/3, has no right to say today, they hate me because I am an indigenous leader. He was voted twice with more than 60%. He had 2/3 of the parliament. He was the most popular president. He was benefiting of the most important economic cycle in our history. And after that, he started dismantling democracy and creating an authoritarian government. The third election was not constitutional. He said that the country, that the Constitution provides for 2 terms, but the first term was during another state. It was not the state of Bolivia, it was the state of the plurinational state of Bolivia. That dubious interpretation of the Constitution was the first violation. Later, as you all know, he wanted to be reelected for the 3rd time, which was completely a violation of the Constitution, but he organized a constitutional tribunal that admitted that permanent re-election was a human right for Evo Morales. This was a copy of the same argument and the same procedure that President Ortega did in Nicaragua. But what happened in Bolivia is that there was a referendum and allow his re-election. He lost the referendum, and then he used this argument that was a human right, and he continued and he was registered by the electoral court that he controlled also as a candidate for the elections. People start getting angry, even people that was supporting him before was very angry by this issue. He did a lot of things. He used the power of the government to promote his candidacy to the presidency. He violated a lot of the rules of the electoral laws in Bolivia. Finally, the election day, as you know, he was running mostly against Carlos Mesa, a Bolivian politician who was briefly president after Sanchez de Lozada, and the election had the participation of a mission of electoral observation of the Organization of American States. Immediately, the day of the election, October 20, the first results, as you know, the quick count, was very clear that Evo Morales had to go to the runoff, to the ballotage, and that Mesa was celebrating this immediately after this 84% of the vote was counted. They interrupted the system, so they had nobody knew what was happening. Immediately, the Organization of American States, the mission, which was conducted by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, Mr. Gonzalez, said that this election was irregular. They were very surprised by this interruption, and that they suggest the president to look for a peaceful solution of the problem, and he proposed to have a new second round, a ballotage on December 15. That was his proposal. The president didn't accept, and next day, Evo Morales won by 10.05 the election, and he said, I was elected in the first round. Immediately after that, Bolivians started going to the streets. They were very angry, and he didn't know what to do, so he said, we'll call the OAS again to send a mission to review the integrity of the electoral process. And the OAS, Almagro, said, okay, but this is going to be enforceable, and the result is going to be, you know, it will attach you legally to you are attached legally to this result. Then the mission came, After a few days, a couple of things happened, that an engineer from the University of San Andres in Bolivia came out with proofs of fraud. And immediately after, an incredible thing happened. It's another engineer from Panama, from the company that was having the audit of the elections, came out with the real story and said they wanted our company to audit the servers. They have 2 servers to control the elections, but somehow the guy was a smart, brilliant engineer who was Bolivian, bad luck for the government, and he discovered a 3rd server that was outside the country and had access to the original codes. So they could manipulate the votes from outside the country. That was the real gigantic fraud. So people were so angry. That's why when they talk now about coup d'etat and all the narrative that the extreme left has constructed in universities, even the Washington Post, people in Bolivia is very offended because they are offending their dignity as citizens. 21 days they were protesting. During those days there was music, poetry in the streets, theaters. Nobody was practicing violence. The people from Evo Morales killed 4 people. 2 were shot in Santa Cruz. 1 was beaten to death in Cochabamba, and the other was killed in El Alto de La Paz, was an indigenous leader that was against the mass and was shot. And do you know, all the human rights organizations said something? Look, there was no one comment. No comment for any human rights organization. Okay, now this happened after 21 days, millions of people in the streets, and then Morales tried to bring the army to control, to have a estado de sitio, and then the police sided with the people, and the army had 2 options. Or they go against the people and the police, and that would be a bloodshed. Second, they don't support the Morales instructions. A brief thing here. The army had an experience during the overthrow of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. They went out to the Alto. There was a big fight there. There were bombs, dead people from both sides. And what happened? Those generals are still in jail in Sucre. It's almost 18 years that they are in jail. So the militaries knew that Morales was at some point would leave the country and they would be accused in tribunals or domestic or international, and they would end up in jail. So they decided that they are not going against the people, and the general came and said, you know, according to our rules of engagement, this is too dangerous. What I suggest is that you follow the advice of the people and resign. And Evo Morales did that because he realized he has no support from the military. He resigned. What kind of coup d'etat is that the president resigns? The militaries ask him what he wants to do. He says, I want to go to the Chapare. They took him in the presidential airplane to the Chapare. Then he decides to leave to Mexico. Immediately after, now we have a constitutional problem. First, he resigned, that's clear. But he had a strategy. I don't know very clearly what was the strategy. He asked the vice president to resign, the Senate, the president of the Senate to resign, and the president of the lower chamber to resign. So the Constitution has no provisions after the president of the lower chamber. That's the end of the provisions. So Morales was thinking that there was going to be, you know, a vacío de poder in the country, and that they would call him to negotiate because there was nothing. Well, lawyers, like always, they discovered that there was a provision in the Bolivian laws that there can't be vacío de poder, that they have to take some measures ipso jure. So they have to call someone to be. So Mrs. Jeanine Áñez, is not that they choose, the political party choose her, was the only authority president of the Congress. So according to the interpretation of the Constitution, the person that would be in charge of the president was the authority, the higher authority beyond the people that resigned. So that's why they decided to appoint her as interim president. Of course, there was nobody to put her the symbols of the presidency. She did herself. Because, as the editorial at the New York Times said, in an irregular situation, don't expect regular solution. It's impossible. It's very logical that. And so what happened is that she put herself, she had a Bible. Many countries in the world, people swear in a Bible. I don't see, but for many people it's now a scandal. And there was no military giving her, except that the presidents have a military attaché on the back. But it was not appointing her president, as the narrative of many people says. So after that, the president has to do the following thing. And this is very clear. This president has only one thing to do: call for free and fair elections as soon as possible and have an electoral could accomplish the most transparent elections in our history. That's it. But she's facing problems. One of them is the Congress is controlled by 2/3 by Evo Morales. So she called for Congress. They didn't want to come the day she called. They wanted to do their own meeting and don't accept the resignation of Evo Morales. That's politics. So she decided that she has to do elections. She is negotiating. Finally, yesterday, the Senate accepted to call for elections. They have to set a date, electoral tribunal, and they have to immediately decide who is going to compose this electoral tribunal and set the date. This tribunal, once it's appointed, will set the dates for the tribunal. So this with all the problems.
Let me stop you there, because I want to get into all the issues involving the elections and where we are in terms of the negotiations between the interim government and the Congress. But thank you for laying out step by step how we got to where we are. Ambassador Trujillo, I want to turn to you on this question, because the White House obviously was quick to recognize the resignation of President Morales, quick to congratulate interim President Áñez once she took office. I assume there was some assessment of the legality, the constitutionality of the process by which that happened. Can you talk us through what that process was and how you reached the conclusion that you did?
First, thank you, Michael, for inviting us, for hosting this. I think this is a great event, and we would never imagine this as well attended as it is this morning. Regarding the process, I think, echoing Jaime's point, it was a resignation that left a vacuum in power. And that vacuum in power, not being a Bolivian constitutional expert, you rely on the authorities to determine what's the appropriate path forward. But once the Supreme Court determined that Ms. Áñez was the appropriate person to inherit the presidency in an interim basis, it made our decision very easy in not only recognizing her, but also starting to work to support a free, fair, and democratic transition in Bolivia. So I think it wasn't instantaneous. It was a 21-day process. I think you start analyzing, if he resigns, what happens next. I don't think anyone would have imagined, as Jaime said, that everyone would resign, not only the president, but the vice president, the president of the Senate, the president of the lower chamber, and created this vacuum. But I don't think that was by coincidence. I think that was by design. And I think the design was, we want to create an empty space in which there's no governability and try to change the political circumstances. I think fortunately for the Bolivian people, it was a peaceful transition. Evo Morales was able to leave and claim political asylum in Mexico, where he's currently stationed, and the government has moved forward in announcing that they're going to hold free, fair, and democratic elections, which is the only solution out of this crisis.
Thank you, Ambassador. John, I don't want to dwell on this point, but WOLA has been sort of more critical of the process by which this happened. So would welcome your thoughts on that, and then perhaps your thoughts on how this kind of shapes the path forward.
Yeah, thank you, Michael and Dialogue, for hosting this. And I would say, there's been a lot said already. I would agree with Ambassador Aparicio. There's a key inflection point entering into this, which was Evo Morales' determination to seek re-election despite having lost a constitutional referendum that would allow that. He moved ahead anyway. I think he lost a lot of support among his own ranks as a result, and I think it led to the closeness of this election. And then there's a lot to talk about in that respect. But I think in terms of interpreting what would happen in the line of succession, There's obviously differences of opinion, and the fact is that the Constitutional Tribunal found that this was the legitimate way forward, and there is an interim government. In our view, the line of succession didn't allow for anyone other than those people named. And under Article 410 of the Bolivian Constitution, there's no allowance for laws less than the Constitution to be valid. So it seemed to call for, in the case of no quorum in the Senate and no ability of the majority party to even have a say, that those new authorities within the Senate and the House would have to be named, and that they would have a legitimate claim. Now, as it happened, the argument for immediacy and fill the power vacuum is what won the day and led to the naming of the interim government. But I think the question of that interim government's legitimacy under the Constitution still has doubts, and I think the question of the conduct of the interim government with regard to its the doubts about its legitimacy in some quarters is an extremely important question. If their role is precisely to lead the country as quickly as possible to free and fair elections, the question is that what they are focused on doing? Because their legitimacy depends on fulfilling that particular mandate. And I think that's where, in terms of Bolivia's governability, the legitimacy of the next round of elections, I think that's where the focus needs to be. And I think by and large, that's where it is. There's a lot to discuss, obviously, in terms of interpreting exactly what happened and why, and people are going to disagree, and we all bring our own confirmation biases, evidence that fits with our pre-existing biases we like. If it doesn't, we dismiss it. I think we need to understand and try to rise above those biases. And there's fault on all sides. And I think both sides will paint this as their heroic, peaceful revolution, and the demonic other. And I think we need to move away from that, because for Bolivia to move ahead towards peaceful, free and fair elections with credibility and governability for whoever takes office as the next elected government, not interim government, those rising above those biases and tendency to demonize and vilify one another is going to be really important.
Great. Thanks, John. Marcela, your thoughts on this, both in terms of what's happening in Bolivia, but then also the role of the international community thus far?
Thank you, Michael. I think you're right that the role of this interim government is indeed to move to free and fair and transparent elections. But it's also to avoid a civil war. And I think that is the priority for Bolivia right now, and I think it's the priority for the international community, which I think should rally strongly behind this interim government to make sure that happens. Because this story has not been written yet. I think there's a lot in flux, there's a lot at play, and there's a lot at stake. This is an incredibly fragile situation where emotions and tensions are extremely raw and dangerous. We have a former president who left inciting people to come with violence, and like the first protest. So it's very easy for this to turn into a civil war, which is why I think the international community needs to be unequivocally supportive of the free and fair elections and this interim government, whether it's the OAS with the elections, whether it supports with technical assistance to the new interim government, whether it's peacekeeping forces if it comes to that. But I think that needs to be our priority.
You mentioned the threat of escalating violence. The violence thus far has been significant. Ambassador Aparicio, I think the numbers are over 20 killed, over 500 injured. The interim government has accused President Morales of trying to foment his supporters to kind of lay siege to cities and deny them food. Very sort of disturbing images and reports coming out of Bolivia. What is your assessment of the situation on the ground and the potential for either escalating violence or finding a more peaceful path for resolving this dispute?
Well, thank you. I was these last 10 years working on human rights issues, so of course I am always worried, and nobody wants to see dead people. That's something we would really won't make any excuse if there is disproportionate use of the force by the army. The problem here is two problems. First is that we need people from the Human Rights Commission in place to know what's happening, because there are both versions from both sides that people was killed by Morales, some of the people, because it's very clear that they need dead people. There's this video of Morales asking his guys, don't let these people go to the Congress because we are lost. They go and fight. That's the word he's saying. Fight to this guy that, by the way, was a guy that was in clandestinity because he was a drug trafficker. But regardless that, we are talking about human rights and people. What we need is the presence of we don't need communiques from Washington. We need people there to see what's happening. Because it's easy to send a communique saying we're worried about who, we want to know who is killing this. There are ballistic studies that shows different things. So we have to see what's happening in place. I hope we find a peaceful way. And what they were saying, I completely agree. We want a peaceful solution, but we can't be naive. Bolivia is not, like in the past, a domestic problem at this point. Bolivia is part of a larger strategy. Argentina is very involved in the situation of Bolivia. Actually, the piqueteros from Argentina are all working in the media, doing spots and messages, accusing the government of violence. There is a whole movement from the Grupo de Puebla, and there is one problem that has to be put here in the table is drug trafficking, because Bolivia has become not only a strategic place because of its location, but because it's a financial center for the FARC, for the opposition, and many people is interested in keeping that. Why inert? Evo Morales was there. Why inert? There is the most modern airport in Bolivia is in Chapare, where there's no tourism. And what is airport doing? There are other 4 airports in the Chapare. 95% of the production of coca in the Chapare goes to drugs. So if we ignore those facts, we won't understand what's happening in Bolivia, because many people can't let Bolivia fall, and Argentina is going to be completely isolated. His only partner will be Venezuela and Mexico. And for Argentina, it's a question of survival to keep Morales in power. And that's why they are doing what they are doing in La Paz, creating all this upheaval and this violence. And it's very dangerous. Is a project, and there are intellectuals that are supporting that process because for these people the ideology prevails over democracy and human decency. And so what Raymond knew of people really, because it's the situation in Bolivia at this point.
Is there a date, just to follow up on, you mentioned the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Is there a date for the Commission to visit Bolivia?
I hope they are arriving today or tomorrow. We invite publicly. This is a public place. Everybody wants to go there. It's urgent.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Trujillo, on the subject of the OAS, the United States joined 25 other countries yesterday in approving a resolution calling for urgently on the authorities to call elections. I think there's broad consensus on the panel that this is the way forward for Bolivia. The interim government seemingly has been slow to take the step of convening those new elections. What do you perceive as the delay, and are you optimistic that with this resolution we will see elections called in the near future?
Thank you. Obviously, it's an interim government that never expected themselves to be in a position to be running the country. And I think we have to keep that in mind when perceiving whether it's slow or fast or adequate. The interim government immediately invited the OAS to not only work towards the electoral observation, but also participate in the election and democratic rebuilding, which is a process in and of itself. So I think we are very optimistic that all their intentions are to call free, fair, and democratic elections. They're willing to work with the OAS, not only in the observation piece, which I think it's very important to highlight. the work that the OAS played in the first round. Gerardo Igaza, Guerrero, the two of them, Francisco Guerrero and Gerardo, did an exceptional job in running it with integrity, running it being completely independent and open-minded, and I think the outcomes of their work speak for themselves. So the interim government, I think, has the best of intentions and has shown it not only through words but also through actions in inviting the OAS to participate in the rebuilding, inviting the OAS to participate in the observation, inviting the Inter-American Commission to come down to Bolivia and help keep an eye and investigate from some of the acts that have happened in the past. But I think it's very important to highlight one thing that we haven't discussed is the role that Evo Morales is playing in trying to destabilize the country. If we're going to discuss a peaceful transition, if we're going to discuss democratic elections, if we're going to discuss a way forward, we have to recognize that Evo Morales was allowed to leave the country. The military gave him that option. He fled to Mexico. He claimed political asylum. And while claiming political asylum, he's acting as a political actor trying to destabilize the country and calling for violence. I think that is completely unacceptable. It's a violation of the terms of the Vienna Convention. And it's something that the Mexican authorities have to investigate. I'm sure most of you are aware of the audio recordings that I'm referring to. We're not sure the veracity of those, but at a minimum, I think it merits an investigation. And if he is inciting violence and inciting not allowing people to have access to food and water, it's something that the Mexican authorities have an obligation to not only stop, but to remedy.
On this point, Marcela, there's been obviously these accusations leveled against President Morales of incitement from abroad. There's also been, on the other side, some certainly provocative language used by leaders close to the interim government, in some cases part of it. This is in a context of a country with a history of polarization along regional lines, ethnic lines, certainly political lines. How much of a concern do you think this is, and what can be done to try to bridge some of these divides at a really delicate moment?
Well, there are a couple of things. One to reiterate this, the role of the armed forces that has been discussed here, which actually up until now it has been it's been notable in its restraint, and it's probably given the history that Jaime discussed. But there's this saying from Simón Bolívar that I think was very much present during those 21 days, which is "Maldito el soldado que apunta un arma contra su pueblo," which is "Damn be the soldier that points a gun against its own people." And I think, if anything, the armed forces have been restrained during those protests and did not go to the streets until it was asked, and the police felt overwhelmed by a protest that came armed. And I think it's going to be very important in this moment that the armed forces continue to support the democratic process. And as of now, it hasn't taken civilian duties. It hasn't done any of those things that people feared. But like I said, I think it's a very delicate moment when you have, 35-40% of the population being incited to go to the streets, and the chaos that might ensue. On your question of the divisions, they have always been there. They usually have been, historically ethnic and regional. I mean, Bolivia is a country where the wealth used to come from the Potosis, La Paz, the mining, and the political power came with that. And the east was the backwater. And then as mining came down and Santa Cruz got gas and agriculture became more of a powerhouse, but power was always centralized. So there was always this tension of power between the East and the North, and extreme poverty that fell around racial lines. But if anything, there has been a lot more internal migration because of these economic forces that have changed that. And I do think that, given credit with all the things that Evo did in terms of decreasing poverty, in terms of giving indigenous people rights and presence in the political process, he also aggravated this divide. And it was a typical populist move, the way Maduro and other populist leaders have done it, of benefiting from the us versus them. So those racial divides have been, if anything, aggravated in at least in the last two terms of him being in power. And I think it's going to be important. And these last 21 days, if anything, have seen the unity that I haven't seen in a really long time in Bolivia. When you have, the head of the civic organization in Santa Cruz holding hands with the Ponchos Rojos, which are the militia from the indigenous people that called Evo and said, look, from the Aymara tradition, don't lie, you don't kill, you're not lazy. You lied in this election and you turned against us. And those alliances are things that we haven't seen in history, and hopefully it's the start of trying to heal that. But you're right, the history is there, it's going to continue to be there, and it's going to be important that the new government bridges that. And whoever comes next, the next president, rules for all Bolivians.
To the point of what awaits the next elected government. John, there's a lot happening seemingly behind the scenes in La Paz at the moment. There's negotiations between the interim government and the Legislative Assembly on a potential path forward towards elections. You also have mediation efforts by the UN, the EU, the Vatican. Can you kind of bring us up to speed on what that looks like and what the prospects are from your point of view?
Thank you. Obviously, it's a very dangerous moment. I think everyone's made that clear because of the polarization, because of the massive distrust, and because of the way that is fed, and we can hear it, I think, in the conversation now, the way it is fed by sort of a one-sidedness of the accusations. And I think incitement to violence goes both ways. It's on both ends. And I think that is why the Inter-American Commission is going. That is why the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is sending a team. That is why Secretary General Guterres has sent an envoy to find a way to a peaceful path forward that is obviously has to be agreed by Bolivians. So my understanding of what is happening now, focused in La Paz, is the Catholic Church and the EU have invited the sides to dialogue in the context of ideally framing legislation that takes Bolivia as quickly as possible to free, fair, credible elections. That Guterres envoy is assisting in those efforts at dialogue, bring people together. I'm not sure how fruitful it has been thus far, but the work is ongoing. I think the key, institutionally speaking, the key venue for these agreements to be hammered out and some negotiated understanding of what's coming and then actually legislating it has to be in the Cámara de Diputados and the Senate. And I think that is where the action ultimately is beginning and taking place. And I think there are more talks between leaders who understand at some point Bolivia is on the brink now, and their leadership is going to be required to step above their partisan interests and make some accommodation for the other side in the realization, and I think everyone understands this ultimately, it is a plural country. There are important political and social movements that don't feel represented by one side or the other. They need to be included. I think that's where the action is right now. I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I would say that I'm hopeful that these talks that are underway are really focusing on these next steps and focusing the interim government, in coordination with the legislature, which is both houses are still 2/3 Mas majority, to find a way through. And I think that's actually good because both sides are going to need to talk to one another. You can't do it without the other. The interim government, as I've mentioned, we had questions about its legitimacy. There it is. You need to work with it. Same thing. There's a lot of ill will between folks in the interim government and people in the Mas and their representatives in the legislature. They're going to need to work with one another to find a way forward. So I'm not saying there's the agreement. We see it before us, but I'm saying I think there is work being done to get there as quickly as possible. What quickly will mean, I'm not sure, but I think it's clear that the OAS is prepared to do monitoring. We've heard that already. I think the UN is also prepared, if asked, to step in in terms of what the UN system can do to help, not just in terms of technical support for elections and monitoring, but in terms of sort of maintaining the peace and follow-up. Because as we look to these next elections, whenever they take place, they're likely to be close again. And I think that calls for everybody to understand that as problematic as our institutions may be, hemispherically and even globally, and as difficult as the moment is in Bolivia right now, no one can afford another episode like this. There are going to be close elections, and I think all the systems need to be in place, and every measure of confidence for Bolivians that they can vote in a free and fair election needs to be taken. I think that's the burden, but it's also the opportunity that exists for the Congress right now and the interim government. And I think the fact that there is so much focus right now from the UN system and the Inter-American Commission on rights issues, participation, is going to also help the interim government focus on their conduct. And their mandate under the Constitution is really to get to elections as quickly as possible. Obviously, there's a country to be governed, but not sort of fanning the flames if they can help it, and making sure that if there are violations of human rights, for example, military opening fire on protesters, that those be clarified, investigated as soon as possible, and not repeated. And where there are inflammatory steps by the interim government, such as a decree that would seem to grant immunity for security forces for engaging in abuses, that be withdrawn as well. So there's a lot already going on. Luckily, there's a lot of attention focus, and I think that's going to help.
Thanks, John. You raised the issue of this decree. I want to turn to Ambassador Trujillo. Secretary Pompeo issued a statement yesterday in Bolivia, which I would commend to everybody. The statement underscored the irregularities in the October 20th election, commended the Bolivian people for standing up for democracy, a lot of the issues we've discussed here, but it also expressed support for peaceful protest and peaceful assembly, called on the security forces to respect the rights of demonstrators, and insisted on accountability for violations of human rights. It's hard to read that statement and not understand sort of an implicit criticism of some of the actions of the interim government, particularly this decree which purports to shield security services from abuses committed in enforcing public order. Is that a correct reading, and have those concerns been conveyed directly to the interim government?
I was traveling yesterday. I haven't had an opportunity to review that statement that came out, I'm assuming, yesterday afternoon. I think regarding the State Department standard position and the Secretary's position, we're never in favor of impunity. I think in any system, whether it's Bolivia or in Central America or in any part of the world, you should never feel a sense of impunity. Whether you're a member of the military, whether you're a member of the government, whether you're a member of the civil society or the opposition. So any person who thinks that they could violate human rights under the guise of I'm a member of the military, or I'm a member of the opposition, or I'm a political prisoner in Mexico, we're completely against just the sense or the notion of impunity, especially for human rights violations. So I think our position has been very, very clear. And regarding the path forward, we could spend, I think, a lot of time, some of the panelists have said, debating the legitimacy or the line of secession or what exactly happened or who's responsible. But I think the only thing that will heal their country is both sides coming together, calling for free, fair, democratic elections, and respecting the outcome of the elections. And I think that's the hardest part. It's really easy to say, I'm willing to participate in an election. But the second I lose, am I willing to accept the results? It's a lot different than participating. And I think going forward, we've already seen from the MAS that they will bring their new candidates. And I think that's a sign, even for their own party, of healing and reconciliation, of saying, all right, we are a party, we're not an individual. Our party believes in certain principles. We're willing to promote candidates that believe in those principles, and we want the Bolivian people to decide. Seeing the outcomes from the last elections before the fraud took place, they were close elections. I think that's completely undisputed. I don't think any part or any ideology or any group has a full mandate on the outcomes. A second round was definitely in order. I think that's also undisputed. And I think one thing that people kind of continue to gloss over is that there was a lot of fraud that was committed, and that fraud was at the hands of the governing party. That's something that we just can't take for granted, that we can't brush aside. If that fraud would not have taken place, would some of these violent acts have occurred? And ultimately, there's a root cause for some of this responsibility, and I think we have to look at that. When people acknowledge that a lot of fraud through multiple servers was taking place, the fraud was only discovered through an independent panel, people have to be held responsible for that fraud, and they have to accept accountability for their actions. It's really easy to look forward and say, well, the government should have done this, and the intergovernment should have done that, and the opposition, and the fraud wasn't committed by every person in the party. But those individuals who thought they could steal an election, those individuals thought who could trample democracy the way that they were trying to do, should be held accountable. And I think that's part of the reconciliation for the country going forward.
Does that mean exclusion from the election?
I think it depends. I think individual actors who are trying to steal the election. I'm not a Bolivian. Hello? I'm not an expert in Bolivian law, but I think the rule of law should prevail. And whatever the rule of law calls for, that should be the only outcome that's acceptable. Because going back to your original comment, impunity is never acceptable. And the second people feel that they have impunity, there's no longer rule of law. And if we're going to promote rule of law, impunity can't exist.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Aparicio, on this issue of the military decree, do you see that being withdrawn?
Well, I must say, hello, that I agree with what John was saying about serving peace and having people from the Inter-American Human Rights in place and have a clear figure of what was happening. If there are responsibilities, they have to be punished according to the law, definitely. The decree, I have to explain why there is this decree. And it has to do with history. During the overthrow of President Sanchez de Lozada, I told you this, there are 3 militaries that are in jail. So the militaries don't want to go out and then be blamed to do a work that it's not the regular work. They are not organized to deal with public security. It's the police that does that. So only in case when the police can't afford fighting with people with dynamite and especially people of the Chapare, and they can't, they need help. So they ask the army, and the army says, okay, but we need a decree signed by the president and all the ministers in which they order us to go and collaborate on public security. But there is an article says that it's very clear. Please read this article. Says the militaries are not granted impunity because they have to act according to the rules and the rules of engagement of the army, and they are possible. And they have to abide by the international conventions that Bolivia has signed on human rights. So there is no impunity for illegal use of the force or disproportionate use of the force, and they could be prosecuted for individual actions they commit. This decree, the only thing that does protects the army to be sued as a collective army because of individual crimes. The crimes have to be individual and not prosecuted as a result of the army intervention in public security. So, but this is a law. It's a decree that was approved before. I don't know if Evo Morales or during Carlos Mesa, I am not sure, but was approved and said when the army has to go and overtake the police because of national convulsion, they have to.
So you disagree with the criticism of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Human Rights Watch of the decree itself? You don't think it's an obstacle to accountability for any abuses that might be committed in the framework of
yes, because the context. They didn't see, I wrote to Jose Miguel Vivanco and the Human Rights say, look, the context. It happened because of this reason. So the president says the police is overtaken by the violence. I don't know what to do. Goes to the militaries. The military say, look, this rule, you need to sign an agreement. So.
Let me ask you just a kind of a broader question. There was an op-ed published this week in the Washington Post by President Morales' UN ambassador, I guess your predecessor in that role. She obviously has a very different view on the events that led to the resignation, but she ends the op-ed with the following statement, and I want to get your reaction to it and see if there's any of this that you agree with or disagree with. She says, the only way out of the crisis is a national dialogue that allows for new elections with full democratic guarantees for all political parties and an agreement on the election of new members of the electoral tribunal. And at the same time, repression and persecution should stop immediately. Would you disagree with anything in that statement?
No, 100%. But violence should be stopped on both sides. That's the thing. It has to. That's why we need third parties to control, because there's dynamite, there's people armed, and that's people that it's protecting their business in the Chapare. They are not concerned about other things. So if there is intervention and there is a real and fair process, I think I agree completely with that. And I agree that in these new elections, the mass has to participate. Not Evo Morales, probably not the mass as mass, because they commit the worst electoral crime you can commit in a democracy. They blessed the Bolivian soul. You know, stalling an election is a crime, I think, everywhere in the world. So what people is saying is, okay, the mass has to participate, and I agree, fully agree. And probably they would have 20-25% of the vote. They would be inside the Congress, and my thought would be move on. Bolivians have to move on.
Great. John, on this question, what do you see as these negotiations continue, that I think you said you were hopeful about, if not optimistic? What do you think are the key elements for the kind of free, fair, inclusive elections, credible elections that you mentioned?
I think part of it has to be, it has to do with naming, of course, the new electoral authorities. I think that's a key question. I mean, ideally you're able to identify people who everybody can consider to be, despite whatever their political orientation is, that they're able to be as impartial and fair in carrying out their duties as possible. That's a tall order in this environment, but I think it's doable, and I think it's something that is what a Congress is created to do. These are the places where those decisions are made, and the Constitution gives the Bolivian legislature that responsibility, and I think that's where it will lie. 6 of the 7, in my understanding, and there may be better authorities than me on this, would be named by the Congress under the Constitution. So moving forward, I think that is the key question, to begin to calm tensions and inspire confidence that the legislature, with, you know, all interests represented, are going to map out a process that Bolivians can feel some semblance, some modicum of confidence that there's going to be a fair process, and that their vote is definitely going to be counted this time. So I think that we're a ways from that, but I think that's the purpose of the international accompaniment right now, to make sure that that level of confidence going into the elections, whenever they take place, hopefully soon, but not in a way that this confidence can't be rebuilt before then. And I think in that sense, the idea of calming the waters a bit, because the tensions are so high, has to go hand in hand with that. I mean, it's going to make matters that much more difficult if the situation remains hot and tense because of accusations of overstepping bounds on both sides. And I think the interim government has a special responsibility in that sense to investigate accusations of disproportionate use of force by security forces. And again, I think in that sense, the idea that international attention is focused, the idea that there are many governments who know they have a stake in making sure that Bolivia doesn't fall to pieces now, because it would be totally unnecessary, it would be totally tragic.
Marcela, looking a little further forward, the next president will succeed President Morales, who was in office for almost 14 years, leaves a mixed legacy of economic orthodoxy, growth, poverty reduction, social inclusion, but also obviously growing authoritarianism and breakdown of democratic institutions. And they're going to face challenges, I think, on all these fronts. The economy is slowing, perhaps even entering recession after years of commodity-fueled growth. The judiciary in particular has been weakened and politicized. Bolivia now ranks 132nd in the world on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. And on top of this, of course, it appears the new president, whoever he or she is, will have to deal with this, the legacy of this very divisive and polarizing election. So can you talk a little bit just about the inbox of the next president, and how the current events are likely to shape their ability to deal with that inbox?
Yeah, well, Bolivia is going to have it rough, and that was irrespective of this. And it's a bit of what you explained, and mostly both on the rule of law, but economically, as we discussed, Evo benefited from the biggest commodity boom, tripling of exports of gas. And he didn't squander them. Minister Arce were relatively fiscally responsible. They grew the reserves, but they also did not do the investments necessary for that growth to be sustainable. So they did not invest or were able to attract investment to do sufficient explorations. So the reserves are been coming down and will be depleted in the next decade. And this is what we've started to see since 2014. Even lithium, if there are these investments, are not going to come to fruition in the next 4 to 5 years. If you wanted to maintain the 5%, and we did this analysis once of 5% growth rate, you would have had to triple exports that were non-gas exports in Bolivia, and those have shrunk during this time. So we have not laid, in Bolivia, this government has not laid the foundation for future growth. So I think a recession is coming. Now, it's important that you don't want that in the hands of a populist government that has no checks and balances, because you only have to look at Venezuela and how in those times, food and medicine were used as political weapons, and it exacerbated the economic recession, to put it mildly. So I think what will be important is exactly what we talked about, to free and fair elections, but to reinstitute the rule of law, because for investments locally and internationally, they need to know that the rules of the game, and that if they speak against the government, they're not going to have the fiscalia or the courts against them. And those are the basics for Bolivia to use its natural resources and incredible wealth and talents to diversify the economy at a time that they will need to.
Thank you for the plug for the Rule of Law program. So we've got a little time left, and I know there's a lot of people in the room that know a lot about these issues. So I want to open up for questions. Maybe we'll take 3 at a time. Please just stand and introduce yourself and keep your comments brief. We'll start with the gentleman right here.
Good morning. My name is Carlos Aramayo Raña, Bolivian citizen. 2 comments. I hear a lot of
It's questions.
It has to be said. There's a narrative out there that portrays the indigenous Bolivian population as monolithic. This is an Orientalist narrative. The indigenous population is not monolithic, is mosaic. Second, I invite everyone to visit Bolivian engineer Edgar Villegas in his Twitter account. You can download the report that he did that showcases the metadata. I have to point out that I have background in cybersecurity. The fraud is there. I mean, if you don't want to see it, you will choose not to see the metadata, but math doesn't lie. It was there. And then here's the question.
Okay.
I would appreciate if anybody in the panel could comment the division that exists within the MAS right now. You have Eva Copa, President of the Senate. You have Ms. Salvatierra, who seems not to realize that the country is trying to move on, that is trying to pacify. So how is it that you foresee that that fragmentation within the MAS going forward? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I saw a hand in the back. There was a woman in the back who had her hand up. No? Yes, right here.
Thank you. My name is Paola Lopez. I'm part of platform in Facebook that the name is Mujeres Fuertes. Born because what is happening in Bolivia. The question. Evo Morales in this moment is an asylee person. How he can still having with the help of Mexican government doing this speech, calling the people to confronting in Bolivia, using Twitter to do that. If we analyze from the fraud, the election fraud to till this moment, we can see that he changed his speech a lot just to confront. So how the international community can help to turn off the microphone of this guy because he's confronting us, and also his Twitter is doing the same. That's the question.
Thank you. Let's get Maria Otero here in the front.
Maria Otero, we Bolivians living in the United States see both of our countries polarized and really divided in a way that is going to be very difficult to resolve. I mean, we're watching an impeachment process in this country that is demonstrated what is happening here, and we're seeing that in Bolivia. So my question to the panel is, what are the steps that a new government, as Ambassador Aparicio was saying, Bolivians have to move on. What are the steps that a new government in Bolivia would need to take in order to be able to decrease this enormous polarization that is in case in Bolivia right now? And the second question is, during the 14 years of Evo's rule, the vibrancy, the liveliness of a political leadership on any side, including the indigenous mass, has really been eliminated. I mean, Bolivia has a huge vacuum in new generation of leaders. So I just wanted to put that before and ask, how do you foresee that very important piece of the puzzle moving forward?
I said we'd take 3. We're going to take 4 because my boss has a question.
Thank you. I hope it's okay. This is a non-Bolivian question. First of all, congratulations and thanks for a great panel. Just a question of clarification in terms of the OAS audits and allegations of fraud. Is the question whether Morales got 47%? I mean, I know that it was established that he didn't have enough to win on the first round, as he claimed. But even so, did he get 47%? Because if he did, or do we know how much he got? Do we have any idea? Was there no way to determine that? The second is, Michael mentioned people who are aligned or close to the interim government, but the name hasn't been mentioned of Mr. Camacho. And I want, if Ambassador Aparicio can comment on how much influence he has at this point, and whether you think he's playing a constructive role to achieve the aims that you say. And another question for Ambassador Aparicio is, it has been suggested by some that if they can't reach an agreement and reach a negotiation on how to move forward, that the interim government could issue a decree to have elections. Is that constitutional? And if it happens, what would be the consequences?
Great. Let's take those. Great questions. Maybe we'll just start with Ambassador Aparicio and come down the line here.
Okay. I'll try to answer very briefly all of them. Of course, Bolivia is a mosaic, and it's true that when we talk about indigenous leaders, we have to talk about all the division there also, because many people probably doesn't know that the cocaleros from the Yungas, in Yungas they produce coca only for legal consumption, for the 10,000 hectares that were allowed in the Vienna Convention, so that those cocaleros are completely mobilized, supporting the opposition, and were part of it. Same in Potosí with the Colquiri miners and indigenous. So there's a big division. The lower lands, because we didn't have time here to talk about the problem when Evo Morales approved a decree to allow to burn the forest this was an ecological tragedy in Bolivia that affected him in the elections also. But then the other question was why Evo is still calling to fight and to provoke war, and the answer is brief. He realized that he made a mistake by resigning. He made a mistake by asking the other people to resign, and probably his boss, Mr. Maduro or Diaz-Canel, asking him, to return to Bolivia as soon as possible, go to the Chapare and try to recover this. And the Argentinians also are desperate to him to come back, but he's still confronting us, unfortunately. The country is very polarized. So I think that what are the steps, how we move on? And I would say three things. One is institutions. The other is rule of law, as you said. The other is inclusion. We have to forget about hate, about what happened. We have to move on. We have to include all the people that didn't commit electoral crimes or was not violent. All that people has to be included in the next election. And I think that's going to be one possibility, that we pacify the country and we have all these the sensibilities of the population represented in this new election. New leaders, yes. They are very important. The Comités Cívicos have been essential in this rebellion, in this Pacific rebellion in Bolivia. But we have to always talk, and Morales is funny, he never mentions Mr. Pumari, because he's an indigenous, and he's a Quechua indigenous, very articulated. I hope the dialogue will have him soon here. We are working on that. Michael doesn't know, but, but you will see who is Mr. Pumari. Of course, they use Camacho because Camacho is from Santa Cruz. That is now the new engine of Bolivia. Santa Cruz is now what La Paz was in the 19th century, is now Santa Cruz. And Santa Cruz is really Bolivia. Now, it's a mixture of all kind of Bolivians are now living in Santa Cruz. So, these new leaders, Camacho and Pumari, basically, thanks to them, all these things happening. They were essential in energizing the population, young people, to overthrow the government. And Hughes, of course, I don't want to discuss about the Bible. That would be another conference, probably. We could discuss the symbols of politics. Yeah, but the real symbol, do you know what was the real symbol of this Pacific revolution in Bolivia? A letter of resignation. He used a letter of resignation to move all these people and say, I will go to La Paz, go to the Palace of Government and present him his letter. And it was a powerful tool, incredible. It was like in Poland, in many other countries, people was energized because of this letter of resignation. So those two leaders, we don't know what they're going to do. If they go to elections, they could have a huge support. That would change the chances of Mr. Mesa. So we don't know yet, but we'll see. It's going to be very interesting what happens with that. 47% of Evo, no way. I spoke, there were 3 quick counts, and some of them said that he won the election against Carlos Mesa, but it was very clear that was not a win on the first round, that there was a need of a ballotage, of a runoff. I think that not accepting that was a big mistake for Morales. He lost a lot of support meanwhile, and you will see in the next elections. Huh? Probably was 3 to 4 to 5 points difference. But because this was before the fraud, no? This was only the first quick count, sorry. And then, well, that's it.
Thank you, Michael. First, congratulations on a great event, and thank you for my fellow colleagues on the panel. I appreciate the conversation. The only point I'll address that I think was briefly addressed by Jaime, I think he did a great job of covering all the other questions. The issue of fraud, when at 82 or 83%, the second that Morales realized that they were not making it, that they were not winning the first round, is where you see the entire TREP system get shut down. So as far as the outcome, whether he was within 1 or 2 or 3 or 10, we know that his high water mark was 5. That number was going down significantly as they got to the back end. So I think the number is inconsequential because ultimately the mass fraud nullifies the outcome. But I think more importantly, one thing that Jaime mentioned on is just the amount of fraud that took place. I think it's something that we continue to just gloss over. But the fact that they that they had alternate keys to a server, that they had rogue servers, that those servers were trying to steal the election, shows the weakness that they felt going into a ballotage, and whether they had an ability in a ballotage to win and the extent that they were willing to go to in the first round to make sure that didn't occur.
I would add, is that it's still an incredibly fragile situation. And Evo Morales from Mexico has the power to cause a lot of distress to the country, and it's not out of the question that he comes back. And we, just by having seen what's happened in Venezuela, that every time Chavez or Maduro came back, they cleaned the armed forces for anyone that was not loyalist and continued to instill themselves even further in power, so that things like happened in Bolivia have not been able to take hold similarly in Venezuela. I think in terms of how do you heal the country, I mean, the things that are priorities, always, there are a lot of programs, social programs that Evo started that should continue, from bonus to the old people, pregnant people, poor people. It's an extremely poor country with very low productivity. All those transfers are important, should continue, and people should know that a new government does not mean that those are going to go away, aside from all the other ideas around how to bring back legitimacy to the system and strengthen institutions that were weak and became weaker in the last 14 years.
Great. Yeah, I think I'll try to address the polarization question. I think why I said it's a tall order before, and I think the inbox, the new president's inbox, whatever that's going to be, is going to be conciliation, capital C. Yet, as we know, democratic elections are times that accentuate divides as candidates seek to say why they're different and better. And I don't see this electoral moment upcoming in Bolivia being any different. In fact, it may be extremely polarizing. And I think the possibility of a candidate like Camacho, for instance, who brings a very different brand of politics than Mesa has brought, would, I think, assure that level of polarization. And constituencies that supported Evo, some of whom peeled away when they had their doubts about him. But even so, and we've heard whatever the number was in the elections, the MAS turned out strong, notwithstanding a lot of doubts and disaffection with Evo. So in a polarized country, the new president ideally would not be a polarizing figure, him or herself. If that happens, it's going to be a rocky road for governance. It's up to Bolivians to choose how they might buffer against this sort of zero-sum, winner-takes-all politics where it's all at stake in any electoral event. And I think what we saw, and I think the inflection point for Morales, in fact, in terms of his own support and what led to these votes being much closer than previous votes, where Evo was winning by upwards of 60%, is the idea of alternation in power, the idea that one person shouldn't perpetuate in power, no matter how well they're governing, is crucial. I think Bolivians made it clear in rejecting Evo's bid in the first place to go for indefinite re-election, and to build that somehow into the process so that democratic elections aren't zero-sum. Alternation in power is to be expected, and actually losing and being in the opposition can be a cleansing, healthy thing, and it is. And I think getting that expectation back on track can help take some of the venom out. How Bolivians do that in their own constitutional system and assure it and hold their leaders to it, I think, is the key political question. But I think that's what's going to be needed for Bolivians to figure out how to do it, especially because the chances of candidates or potential candidates taking advantage of polarization, taking advantage of sort of hatred and animosity to sow their own political success in a way that changes the country as a whole would be to take a potential step forward now and convert it back into a tragedy. I think, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the questions of fraud, I understood that the OAS preliminary report that was issued on November 10th, in which they said this means we should go to new elections, but there will be another report that provides a fuller summary of their findings. I'm going to wait for that before I say exactly what happened. I think that would be the prudent thing to do.
I'm sympathetic to the people in the back, so let's take 3 more questions from the very back and come back to our speakers for final comments. Straight back.
Thank you. And thank you for opening this dialogue. For us is also important as a Bolivian in the international side, who was being in the streets from the February 21st, that we are fighting against a person who's trying to stay in power. We were in the streets also here in every single country that has a Bolivian in the world. We were fighting to do not allow this guy to stay in power because, of course, there has to be a flaw in the political and the economical and all the sides of the country. The power always has to flow, right? My question is, and sorry for going that back far, going to 2016, why the Bolivian and the international community allowed this guy to commit a fraud against the Constitution, and what is the international community is doing against a criminal who is exiled in a country, and what we are doing against that person who is still moving forces from his phone, affecting our peace, our peaceful in the country.
Thank you. Let's go to the back corner. We'll take those 2 questions there.
Thank you. There has been a lot of misinformation.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, Daniela Pereira. I'm from Bolivia. So something that has been happening over the past few days is that there has been a lot of misinformation, and this misinformation was on both sides and fueled by social media through WhatsApp, Twitter, and so on. So, and that misinformation increased violence and increased the polarization that we see in Bolivia right now. So what are your thoughts about this, and how can we control this, especially after the elections and after this has been solved, because that has been a problem.
Thank you. And right next to you. Last question.
Good morning, and thank you for the dialogue. Oscar Basoberri with World Data. We do have people from Bolivia and from the U.S. as well, but we have people in Bolivia that work with us, and so daily we get reports of what's going on. The key, I think there are 2 sides to reconcile, that's obvious, but one key element is the international play here. Not only in Bolivia, but we're living it here in our country, in the U.S., as Maria mentioned. It is critical to have a strategy of how Bolivia is going to move on in the context of a Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, very, very active in the future of Bolivia. That's all. And the opinion of the panel on that.
Thank you. Okay. We'll have to call it there, and let's do the same thing. Jaime, if we can start with you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, as the lady there said, Bolivia have lived, and that's difficult to understand from outside, but we have our own May 68 in Bolivia. Really, that was in October 20, we had the French May 68, because people was energized, was something very emotional and very impressive. It's absolutely true. Why Evo Morales is continuing to use his platform in Mexico to continue stimulating violence in Bolivia, it's very sad that the government of Mexico is allowing. It's violating the convention, as you said, the Vienna Convention is violating the 54 Caracas Convention that says that they have freedom of speech and opinion, but they can't provoke violence or problems in the country of origin. And Mexico has signed that convention. And then Mexico has did another big mistake. It's they López Obrador decided not to apply the Inter-American Democratic Charter, but the Doctrina Estrada, that was the classical about not recognizing governments but states. But now they use that for Nicaragua and for Venezuela. They say we don't judge governments, we recognize states. But now they change and they say, oh no, there was a coup d'etat, so we don't recognize. But it's very absurd. And finally, the misinformation, yes, it's the misinformation is provoked by an army of people working with an ideological project of the Grupo de Puebla, and it's, I don't know how we can fight that, because they penetrate universities, think tanks, human rights organizations with their own narrative. And I think that in the other side, of course, there's also a lot of things that are not true. So we have to be very careful. It's the only thing I can say. And finally, the role of Cuba and Venezuela in Bolivia, well, it's obvious. 745 people had left Bolivia. The Cubans took them in an airplane very fast, so they can't ask for asylum and start talking. But they were agents with diplomatic credentials of the embassy, and they were doing we don't know what in Bolivia, but they mostly intelligence. There are people still from Venezuela. They're fighting with the cocaleros and with the things that the people from the FARC. Well, that's proved, that was certified. It's a leader of the FARC from Argentinian origin. So we have that problem, and that's aggravating the situation. And I hope from now on will show us our solidarity with the opposition of, with President Guaido, and of course with the opposition to the other dictator remaining in Latin America, Daniel Ortega.
Regarding the 2016 question, I think it was a missed opportunity. Jaime Aparicio, he didn't mention it, but Jaime Aparicio presented a petition before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, did a lot of advocacy work, a lot of legal work in declaring the entire process illegitimate and having the court rule as to the legitimacy of this new human right of eternal re-election. But I think we missed the window. And I think a lot of the reaction you're seeing now, why was Evo Morales at 60% in 2000 and something, and in maybe the mid-30s in 2019. And it's a reaction of people can't feel disenfranchised. And when the will of the voters was that we no longer want him to be our president, we no longer believe in this eternal re-election, and you violate the will of the voters, these are the outcomes that you see. We've seen that it played out in Nicaragua in the past. It's played out, obviously, in Venezuela recently. It's played out across multiple parts of our world. But going forward, I think it was a very, very missed opportunity, and tying it in a little bit with Mexico, this approach that we don't judge other countries, we don't look into other countries, they're all going to be fine, but then the outcomes are human in nature. The people who lost their lives, the people whose human rights are violated, it doesn't only affect Bolivians, it affects everyone in the region. We're especially living that today with Venezuela. And one quick note on Mexico. I think it's very, as we talked about the Estrada Doctrine versus some of the inter-American instruments, they were the only country at the OAS to first not support the last resolution, as one of the bigger countries to not support the last resolution, but also the only country besides Nicolas Maduro, who's no longer recognized by the OAS, to recognize the outcomes of the first round and declare Evo Morales the legitimate winner. I think it speaks a lot to the way forward for Mexico. I think it speaks a lot to their outlook on foreign policy when Evo Morales himself recognizes that there was fraud and a second round is necessary, his own statements, not mine. And at no point have they retracted that congratulatory note.
I think the only thing to add, and I think it's already been said, is that we can't forget, Bolivians are fighting for their survival right now, and it is still extremely fragile. If anything, they have shown incredible courage, and if anything, we have seen leaders of all sides with less divisive language. But the divisions exist, and mostly the poverty exists. This is the poorest country in South America, so it can't afford a civil war. And this is why I urged from where I started that the international community, we've had the semantics conversations, we've not only have to move on, but in any way possible, we need to help support this transitional government so that they can have free and fair elections.
Yeah, I think that's right that the international community needs to do everything it can to support Bolivia, which in my mind goes beyond this interim government, which needs obviously support, and where it looks to be losing focus and moving on to other conduct of a government that would have had an elected mandate rather than playing the role of interim government. I think they need some gentle persuasion back to focus on what the real need here is, which is to get to free and fair elections that Bolivians can believe in and have credibility. And I think the international community, including, as I mentioned before, the European Union, the UN system, I don't think it's an accident that those are the ones, plus the church in Bolivia, I think it's Bolivian-led, but the countries in the region have been polarized around similar issues, and the way that the Bolivian situation is playing out in those countries is also polarizing, and it leads to sort of less obvious visible help from a polarized region for finding a depolarized way through Bolivia's crisis. So I think that's going to underscore the role of the UN, the EU, support for the interim government, and fundamentally that these solutions are devised by and eventually supported by Bolivians. And right now, the sort of crucible for this, the venue, is the Bolivian legislature itself, trading proposals and negotiating with the proposals from the interim government.
Great. Well, I think this has been a terrific conversation. I want to thank you all very much for your contributions to it. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
¿Me puedes pedir una gente? Abajo podemos tomarnos un café. Yo te busco.